Well, good afternoon on this beautiful sunny Belfast day, and welcome to our webinar to launch our annual Human Rights Report 2021. I'm Doug Garrett, Chair of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, and today you'll be hearing from myself. Then it gets better because it's followed by Human Rights Advisor John Wadham and Temporary Assistant Chief Constable Melanie Jones from the Psni. Unfortunately, with current restrictions, we are unable to hold an in-person event, but I'm delighted that we're having this webinar on International Human Rights Day, a day where the importance of rights in our society is reaffirmed. And for policing, a rights-based approach protects the public and officers responsible for the delivery of the service. After the initial presentation, there will be time for questions, and if you have any non-pre-submitted questions that haven't already been received, then I'd welcome that you do so through the question and answer function, which is available to you on your screen. We will try to respond to as many as we can within the time that we have. However, I should stress that John has another speaking engagement at 1:30, so we do need to finish promptly by 1:25 today. 4th of November 2021 marked, as you will be aware, the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Policing Board and the Psni. Throughout that time, the board's work and oversight arrangements in respect of monitoring human rights has been recognised nationally and internationally as a model of good practice. But it is an area of work that continues to evolve with policing change, societal change, and indeed new technology. Today's report is the 14th published, and it provides an account of the performance of Psni in meeting human rights responsibilities, as well as an overview of the monitoring work carried out during the year by the board. This report has been prepared by our independent human rights advisor, John Wadham, who you will be hearing from very shortly. John, as with his predecessors, has provided the board with independent advice and expertise on Psni's compliance with human rights legislation through written reports and recommendations. He has unfettered access to all parts and people within the Psni, which means he can access and assess any information necessary to inform his advice to the board. The Human Rights Annual Report 2021 contains 20 recommendations for Psni, including human rights training and policy, Psni use of aircraft, treatment of suspects, societal media policy, and legacy investigations. It also revisits issues that were identified as part of the board's report in the policing of COVID regulations, which are back, of course, in the spotlight, giving new discussions around enforcement arrangements. This element of our work is so important as it brings transparency to issues that infringe societal rights, assists public understanding of the implementation of human rights standards in police service delivery, and explains how the board conducts its monitoring work. It helps maintain public confidence in the Psni, which is paramount in securing its legitimacy. An issue that very much been in the spotlight here and within policing nationally and internationally over recent months. This fundamental principle lies at the heart of the work which the Policing Board, assisted by the Human Rights Advisor, carries out on behalf of everyone in our society and community. Over the last 20 years, Psni has implemented over 200 recommendations made in previous annual reports relating to issues such as domestic abuse, hate crime, covert policing, children and young people, public order, complaints and discipline, use of force, stop and search, and most recently, the Psni's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The sheer extent of scope of work undertaken by the Policing Board and the Human Rights Advisor highlights the importance of keeping human rights under review, as there are always new and emerging issues. Having a positive human rights culture in our policing service and a willingness to be held to account to the community through the Policing Board is welcome. With that, I will hand over to our independent Human Rights Advisor, John Wadham. John.
Thanks, Doug. Today we're launching the Human Rights Annual Report for April 20 to March 21, although we do, there are some updates in what's been happening over the last few months. It was prepared by me and the staff of the Policing Board and signed off by Policing Board members themselves. I'm sorry that it's so long. There are 9 chapters and 4 appendices. The appendices, to begin with, this is a lawyer's document, so you won't be surprised. There's a human rights framework. That's about how do we measure what is happening with Psni and how does it comply with human rights. There's also an update on the recommendations we made in the COVID report on the pandemic and how the PSNI dealt with that. Responses to the previous annual report from 2019-20 and some glossaries. So first of all, I think I'd like to compliment the PSNI and its officers on how well they've done over the last year, especially during the pandemic. PSNI understands and complies with human rights very well, probably better than most other forces, including in England and Wales. I'm always impressed about how helpful police officers are in answering my questions and also providing me with whatever documents I want to see, even though often they are aware that I'm likely to be critical in my reports. So I'm going to use the rest of my time now to go through the 20 recommendations we've made today. There'll be time, as you've heard, for questions, so please send those in if you haven't done so already. Obviously, there's more information about the context for those recommendations in the report itself. So we have some slides. So next slide, please. So recommendation 1, this is about spit and bite guards, which is obviously a particular issue that concerns the PSNI and the policing board. The recommendation there relates to training. It was particularly problematic for the PSNI to hold face-to-face trainings during the pandemic. And we have recommended a number of processes in relation to the training, face-to-face training, as well as refresher training. Now, people will also want to know about where is the board and the PSNI in relation to spit and bite guards. The current position is that the PSNI produced an update report to the Performance Committee yesterday. Then we are going to write a report, a thematic or human rights report on the human rights issues. And that will be delivered to the board for its consideration in the next couple of months. And then finally, we expect the PSNI to make a decision about whether spit and bite guards should continue to be used in March. In the next slide, there are a number of recommendations. The first relates to human rights awareness. In 2004, my predecessor, Keir Starmer, who was the human rights advisor at that time, organised with PSNI an independent review of the awareness of police officers of all ranks about human rights and how it applied in policing. So that was some time ago, and what I and the board are recommending is that should be undertaken again. So we should find out exactly how much officers know about human rights and how well they use those human rights in practice. That will take some time, but I would hope that we could complete that over the next year. The third recommendation is about the policies of the PSNI. In our last annual report, we suggested that there should be a review of all of the current policies of PSNI in relation to the work they do, service instructions, etc. And there should be, where it's necessary, an analysis of the human rights issues in the context of their activities. And to help police officers to link their practical work, their activities, with human rights directly, rather than this being an afterthought. It's obviously something that we would like to see as soon as possible, but obviously some of that work has not been able to be taken forward given the pandemic and other issues. In relation to one of those, this is recommendation 4, as many people may know, the the police service have a number of drones that are used, as well as, of course, using the use of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. And we want to see a service instruction dealing with all of those issues, as well as a privacy impact assessment. Now, that's recommendation 4. Recommendation 5 is something which I think police forces are having to deal with across the country, and that is, how does a police force decide how to deal with social media? And in particular, is social media, is the tweets and Facebook contributions that people make being collected up for the purposes of understanding how the public feels about Psni, or is it also being used for any criminal justice purposes? And what are the policies and rules around that? So we're asking the Psni to look at that and to produce a policy on how they use that. So the Psni reflect on freedom of expression, as well as issues of people's privacy. Although, of course, it will be something that the police will have to collect if there's evidence of criminal activities. But we'd like to see a detailed policy, and of course, we'd like to see a policy that reflects and respects human rights. In relation to a similar issue, there are facial recognition systems being used by police forces in other countries, and including in England and Wales. A facial recognition system allows officers to put cameras in public places, and for the computer systems to identify people's faces, and then, of course, to arrest those who are wanted, or where the Psni have to arrest somebody for other reasons. There are really problematic issues in relation to both the algorithms that work the systems and whether they come up with false positives, but also about the fact that people in most countries, and I'm sure in Northern Ireland too, will be concerned about being under surveillance, not just in relation to the normal CCTV systems that we have, but also in relation to being identified, possibly incorrectly, and being arrested and on the basis of that computer system, rather than arrested on the basis of the assessment of a police officer. So the Psni should consult the policing board on that, and there should be a wider public consultation if that process is to go ahead. So that's recommendations 2 to 6. Now, in relation to the next slide, recommendation 7 is about legacy. The annual report doesn't go into the ins and outs of the current government's proposals for some kind of amnesty or immunity, because the details of that aren't available, and the announcements were outside of the time period for this report. However, the key issue in relation to this report is the extent to which legacy cases need to continue to be investigated. And it's been really difficult for the PSNI's legacy investigation branch to do some of those investigations. Firstly, because there is a question about whether they're sufficiently independent. So in certain circumstances, they have referred some cases to a separate process, to the Canova system and to John Boucher's team. But secondly, of course, they have been subject to a series of suggestions that legacy investigation should be taken away from them by a variety of different systems. Obviously, the board's position is there should be an independent process for investigating those cases. But in the meantime, whilst that hasn't been set up, then I am suggesting in the report that the John Boucher approach should be taken forward for all of those legacy investigations, pending any other system being developed. That's obviously a question not just for the policing board, but for the government in Westminster, but also there's a current case pending in the Supreme Court, which may clarify whether or not the Psni has the practical independence to continue with those legacy investigations. So the fourth slide sets out recommendations 9 to 13. These are all concerns about stop and search in the main. We are recommending that the Psni investigate why the so-called success rate for stop and search varies so significantly between districts in Northern Ireland. In some circumstances, whether somebody is arrested or dealt with in some other way following a stop and search in one area of Northern Ireland, the success rate seems to be about 8%, and in other cases it's 4%. And that is difficult to understand why that's the case. And secondly, when we consider how successful stop and search is, there's a question not just about whether someone is arrested as a test of whether the process is working and they're identifying people who are carrying illegal items. So there's a second issue, which is what happens to those people subsequently. How many of those people are in fact charged, prosecuted, and convicted? And I don't think there are any statistics on how that process works. And so we've suggested in the second part of that recommendation, there should be a sample of those stopped and searched and tracked through the process to find out what actually happens at the end of that process. Recommendation 10 concerns looking for better statistics on the numbers of children stopped and searched. At the moment, we have figures on a category of 13 to 17-year-olds, and it would be interesting to see a bit more details about what age people are stopped and searched. And there's another technical question about the recording in the second part to recommendation 10. Recommendation 11 concerns some research that Dr. John Topping carried out on behalf of the Psni two or three years ago, where he was able to talk to police officers, both those being trained and officers in the job, about whether or not how they dealt with stop and search. And one of the allegations that we mention in the annual report is that he suggests that there are targets for stop and search. Now, we would like to see that research published so that everyone, all members of the public in Northern Ireland, can see what he found, and hopefully we can also see what the Psni has done subsequently on the basis of his recommendations. And that leads on to the second part to that recommendation, recommendation 11. The board and I have had some difficulty in understanding what the strategic approach is taken to stop and search. Of course, stop and search is an individual power by an individual officer based in general on reasonable suspicion that a person is carrying an illegal item. But the question that I can't understand is how this process is given a strategic approach, how officers in the morning when they go on shift are told how they should use or not use stop and search. And so we are seeking to see, given the low level of success of stop and search generally, what the Psni's leadership approach is to the use of stop and search. we'd like to see that made more transparent. So people, particularly those people who are stopped and searched and then no item is found, potentially 96% of people in some districts are stopped and searched and there is no subsequent action, that we can reassure those 96% of people are able to understand why stop and search is used in their district and what it's for. There is a particular detailed recommendation 12, which is about how these stop and search records are kept, particularly where other force has to be used in relation to the process of stopping and searching a person. And then in recommendation 13, this is something that has been an issue for the board for some considerable time, some 6 years or so. In relation to the Justice and Security Act special stop and search power, which doesn't require a police officer to have reasonable suspicion before they stop and search a person, the board has been asking to see a change in process so that there is a record kept of the community background of each and every person stopped and searched under the Justice and Security Act. This has been a recommendation by the board, but more recently, in the last couple of years, the Court of Appeal has said that the PSNI should go ahead with this process, and we suggest it should be implemented immediately. Perhaps we're being optimistic that it will be done by the 1st of January, but nevertheless, we think the PSNI should get on with this as quickly as possible. So we now go on to the next set of recommendations. The recommendation 14 concerns what are called conducted energy devices, or tasers. The number of officers that carry tasers in Northern Ireland is significantly proportionally less than in England and Wales. Obviously, police officers in Northern Ireland carry firearms, but Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary has suggested that the PSNI should investigate whether or not more officers should carry tasers as an alternative to the possibility of using their firearms. That is a very significant step for the PSNI to take, and we suggest that before any steps are taken, there's a greater consultation with the policing board, but also a wider, more public consultation. Recommendation 15 concerns the process of using force. In particular, how police officers consider using their weapons, and particularly firearms. There's been a significant increase in the number of firearms drawn by the police, taken out of their holders but not used. And although obviously we're very pleased that firearms have not been, that the trigger hasn't been pulled and no one's been injured, which is incredibly important. But I'm anxious that if more firearms are being drawn, there's the danger that someone will be shot and injured. So we want to delve into the factors around the various uses of force, including the drawing of firearms. The last recommendation in this series concerns the use of force statistics. The policing board has access to more detailed statistics than are published. And there's a question about whether whatever statistics that we get should be available to every member of the public in Northern Ireland. But more importantly, there also should be a greater disaggregation in relation to the gender, age, ethnic minority, disability, and of course, community background. each and every use of force. We'd like to know the extent to which force is used against each and every one of those categories. And some people on this webinar will have seen the statistics that were produced following a Freedom of Information request about the number of Catholics as opposed to Protestants who are arrested by the PSNI over the last 5 years. We'd like to delve into how the use of force is also the use of force is used against different members of different communities. So the last set of slides, a last set of recommendations, recommendations 17 to 20. Just waver with me. Recommendation 17 is a complex recommendation. It concerns what I've called the asymmetry in intelligence gathering and law enforcement. As most people will know, in Northern Ireland, MI5, the security services, as one remit. The National Crime Agency has a different remit. PSNI has a third remit, but also, of course, the Terrorism Act legislation applies differently to different circumstances. I don't think there's any magic in asking for a debate about that, but I think that we should be considering exactly what level of resources in relation to protecting people, in relation to enforcing criminal offences there should be, and whether from a human rights perspective, one would ask the question about whether the same kinds of resources from the same kinds of, from the different kinds of organizations should apply to, for instance, the right to life. For instance, the right to be safe, both in terms of violence as well as in relation to your property. That's not the case. It's not, it hasn't been designed this way to be not as logical as perhaps we would have wanted it. And often that's because the different organizations have different mandates for different situations. Moving on to recommendation 18. This is a specific provision that does relate to the terrorism legislation. A recommendation from a different independent reviewer, Jonathan Hall, who reviews the terrorism legislation across the UK and has made some specific recommendations about the police using the police and criminal evidence order rather than terrorism legislation, particularly in relation to children, so those children can be given bail, because currently under the terrorism legislation, bail is generally not available. Recommendation 19 and recommendation 20 concern covert policing particularly. And recommendation 19 requests that the PSNI try to be more transparent with the use of their covert powers. And in particular, there's a different, and I'm sorry this is complicated, there is a different system of inspection for those covert powers, the Investigatory Powers Commissioner. They inspect the PSNI's use of covert powers every year. That I've seen 2 or 3 of those recent reports. Generally speaking, the PSNI is doing very well, and any recommendations for improvement are dealt with very quickly. I see no reason why a summary or redacted version of that shouldn't be available more publicly. And secondly, I think more information could be given out by the PSNI about how they use those covert powers. Firstly, because I believe in general, those covert powers are used for lawful reasons. But I'm also aware that many people or small groups of people in Northern Ireland believe that they are maybe being used unlawfully or for the wrong purposes. And I think that transparency would help the PSNI to justify its use of those powers and give the public some reassurance. Lastly, during the year that this report is concerned with, there was a new provision under the exciting Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act to allow informers to commit criminal offences subject to some very specific safeguards. It's always been the case in practice for MI5 and police forces in the UK to be able to have informers, both people not working for the police directly, to collect up information that helps the police to track down criminals and prosecute them, but also for officers themselves to go undercover. And in many cases, and in some of those cases, those people have committed relatively minor criminal offences in order to say embedded with some organised crime group. There was some question about whether the authorisation of those crimes was lawful. And that went to the courts. And now the Westminster Parliament produced legislation which concerns all of these issues across the whole of the UK. And so there is now legislation which allows the PSNI as well as other police forces to authorize informers to commit offences. And although there is guidance from the Home Office on exactly how that should work, I've suggested that we should have more detailed guidance in Northern Ireland to reassure people in Northern Ireland, generally because that's a good idea for people to have as much information as possible and transparency to be a key part of that. But secondly, because there's a lot of examples in the past where there has been criticism of PSNI and the security forces, etc., in using informers who have committed criminal offences. And there's I think, a greater importance in transparency in relation to these difficult and controversial powers in Northern Ireland than perhaps in the rest of the UK. So that's a whiz through 20 recommendations. I'm sorry that some of them are detailed and complex. But the details and the complexity, I hope, is set out more thoroughly in the annual report itself, and people can refer to that. I think I'll now pass back to Doug.
Thank you, John. Thank you for taking us through your recommendations, and indeed thank you for your work in compiling the report and in providing advice on human rights to the board over the last year. We'll now hear, before we come to questions from the PSNI, and today the representative is Temporary ACC Melanie Jones. So over to you, Mel.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to you and the Northern Ireland Policing Board for inviting the police to be part of the launch of the Human Rights Annual Report. I would especially like to recognise the significant work and contribution of John Wadham and his team in the construction of this report. It's fitting that we see the launch of the Human Rights Annual Report on International Human Rights Day. Let us never forget that on this day in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would encourage that we all take a few moments today to reaffirm our commitment to building the world we want, the need for global solidarity as well as our interconnectedness and shared humanity, and what this means to us locally in Northern Ireland. Given that this year has also marked 20 years since the formation of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I felt it would be appropriate to reflect on the journey of the Police Service since its inception, especially in relation to human rights. On Good Friday 1998, the Belfast Agreement was signed, and this heralded a new beginning, A reform of policing was an integral part of the peace process, and this reform included an adoption of a human rights-based approach. The Patten Commission made 175 recommendations, including the formation of the police service. Amongst those recommendations are 3 fundamental pillars: a human rights approach right through the service and into operational delivery of service to our communities, accountability with transparency at its heart, and policing in true partnership with communities. The core aim of this reform of policing was to restore public confidence and legitimacy and develop and embed the principle of policing by consent. I was encouraged when I listened to a lecture by a highly respected and experienced human rights professional recently, when they said about the Northern Ireland policing context that this approach was a tried and tested template that merits consideration in other jurisdictions. One of the most fundamental requirements for the delivery of policing services framed around human rights architecture is the training, development, skill and confidence of our people. This training starts from the very first day of joining the police, regardless of role or rank, and continues throughout everyone's career. Police officers and staff are expected to be human rights practitioners. This is a great responsibility. We are expected to make decisions with integrity, consistently applying the tests of proportionality and necessity. I reflect on my own roles and responsibilities, most recently as an operational commander in Belfast, where I would often reflect that that human rights was my mind map that helped to shape my decision-making. The lifeblood running through considerations and decisions, the oxygen in the room, not something that can be seen or touched, but is fundamental to existence, or in this case, good decision-making. And this integral and universal application of human rights must apply to all of our decisions, for all of the people and for all of the time. This is essential if policing is to benefit from the trust and confidence of our communities. And I have been the policing commander during some of those testing and challenging moments. And I would reflect from the very positive role of the Policing Board's Human Rights Advisor being present in the police command room. Some might find that very difficult to understand. Their role is not to endorse my decision-making, but I found it helpful and reassuring to know that my real-time considerations and decision-makings were being witnessed firsthand and could be reported on impartially. I welcomed that sense of accountability, always remaining open to the personal or organisational learning that may come from it. Thank you, John. But of course, the journey is never complete. The world and our communities continues to change and evolve, as do the challenges facing policing. Never more so than the past 2 years. Policing in a pandemic has brought a range of challenges, but none more so than the role of policing of legislation that has potential far-reaching impacts on the liberty and choices of all. We have recognised and had to deal with an incredibly difficult position that policing and our people have been placed in, being required to interpret legislation made at pace due to the pressing public health considerations against human rights and the potential damage that this can do to public confidence. On the wider issue, we have plans to develop ethics panels to help inform good decision-making and actions around these types of dilemmas through strengthening our community voice. We remain resolute that the police alone should not be responsible for enforcement of health protection regulations. This challenge continues, and I am grateful for the support of the Northern Ireland Policing Board on this matter. Policing in true partnership with our communities continues to develop apace. During the last 12 months, we have developed and embedded an independent advisory group who have made significant and important contributions to policing during this time. I extend my thanks and gratitude to the group for helping to shape and influence how we design and deliver policing services to our communities. The strength and commitment of that partnership is what sets Northern Ireland apart from other places, in my opinion. Our current work to develop a police strategy to address violence, abuse and intimidation of women and girls is underpinned by and informed by the experience and support of the widest array of statutory and voluntary sector partners, including the Children's Commissioner, Victim Support, Women's Aid, to name a few, but the list does go on. testament that the efforts of the collective are far greater than the collective effort of the few. And in closing, I bring my considerations back to the annual Human Rights Review that we are presented with today. The Police Service will fully consider all of the recommendations and findings within this report, and we look forward to working with the Northern Ireland Policing Board to deliver against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel, for those words. We are now going to move to questions, but just to explain the process around responses to the report, the Chief Constable will provide a formal response to the board on all of the recommendations made, and that will then be considered and monitored by the board's performance committee. As we will be publishing this webinar on our YouTube channel, I won't be naming individuals in respect of questions submitted, but we'll simply read out the questions and then move to the responses. Where there's an easy response, I'll probably give that myself. And where there are difficult ones, we'll look to the experts in John and Mel to provide the answers. So the first question reads as follows. Given the public and media interest around enforcement of the regulations, what's the board's view on the PSNI enforcement at the current time? This is clearly to do with COVID, which was referenced by Mel. They also want to know what the PSNI position is. So if I can explain the board position just briefly, then get some comments from John, and then we'll go to Mel for the PSNI's position. Clearly, confidence and reputational issues arising from the enforcement of COVID regulations have really raised issues for the PSNI over the last 18 months. It's important to note, broadly speaking, the board agreed that the policing took a pragmatic approach using the 4 E's, with enforcement being a last resort. We fully support the need to support and protect public health, but from the outset of the pandemic, the board has supported the position that any enforcement should not solely rest with the PSNI, but other agencies should also share that responsibility. There's a provision for this within the regulations, and at the request of the board, I've written to the Health Minister requesting more detail on the commitments other executive colleagues will undertake in terms of the activity, both proactive and reactive, within their respective compliance enforcement responsibilities. I've also emphasised to the Minister the need for continued consultation with the PSNI on any statutory changes being made so that all policing implications can be considered and managed, and clear guidance on rules and responsibilities issued. John, just before we look to the PSNI position, do you have a comment with regard to where the police find themselves in this COVID era?
Yeah, I think that you set it out. That's the board's position. I think that if you get the regulations right, the public's consulted, the PSNI is consulted, you put human rights in that process. You then need to think about issues of enforcement, and the difficulty during the pandemic at the beginning was that many of those things weren't put in place, and sometimes the PSNI got it wrong. But I think there's a bigger question about society, the Assembly, the Executive to get right.
Okay, thank you. Mel, would you like to respond as to where the PSNI find themselves in this COVID?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. I think that we have remained clear and consistent in the enforcement of health protection regulations throughout the pandemic. We've adopted a graduated and proportionate approach with a focus on seeking to gain cooperation and support from the public through the use of the first 3 E's, the encourage, engage and explain. And we will continue to do the same around the issue of face masks. We've also provided extensive explanation as to the change in demand facing policing. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when most people were staying at home, we did have more time and space to focus officers and time on trying to support the stay-at-home message. But actually, our demand has now returned to pre-pandemic levels. And it is important that we remain able to deal effectively with emergency and priority graded calls and to keep people safe and conduct effective and timely investigations. And this means that we simply do not have the time and the resources to put to this matter that we may have had previously. We've also been very open in that we see enforcement not solely as a policing issue. It's a wide-ranging societal issue that brings responsibility for everybody. And enforcement should not just be seen as the issue of issuing tickets and fines. It can be done by other competent authorities through encouragement and through the setting of clear parameters that people are expected to operate within. And lastly, in my experience, actually, when police officers are even within sight or engage with anybody and start to use the first 3 E's, then usually people are very compliant. So there is no requirement in the vast majority of cases for the police to go to the point of enforcement, because the mere sight of a police officer in uniform usually encourages somebody who should have a mask on to put a mask on or to comply by the regulation that they may be temporarily breaching.
Thank you, Mel. Second question also relates to an issue covered in the media yesterday regarding the community background of people who are arrested and charged by the PSNI. This is an issue that will be raised at our next board meeting, as it does require further analysis. But the specific question is one linked to an issue covered in the report around the use of stop and search. And it states, given the recent data revealed by the Detailed TV on 9th of the 12th, 21, that close to double the number of people defined as Catholic are arrested and charged compared to those defined as Protestant, what assurance or evidence can the PSNI give that such religious disproportionality is not being replicated through stop and search powers under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 and the Police and Criminal Evidence Northern Ireland Order 1989, particularly when PSNI policy is not to record religion as part of stop and search encounters? I'll ask John for comment first and then Mel. So, John.
Yeah, I think this is obviously something that the board will need to investigate. If both in relation to the general issue, but also particularly about stop and search. That's one of the reasons that the board has wanted to see community background details collected in relation to stop and search, to see what the problem is, if there is a problem. Obviously, if there is disproportionality between Catholics and Protestants, then that has to be investigated. And the PSNI have a responsibility under the equality legislation to investigate that and find out why it's happening. There may be a justification for it, but that needs to be made explicit. And the board will want to see this happen, because fundamentally it's the responsibility of the PSNI to police equally across society.
Okay, thank you, John. Mel, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I would entirely agree that the data does bring questions, and I welcome the board's intention to undertake greater analysis, but I'm keen that we don't leap to any premature conclusions. The collation of community background data, both for stop and search and arrests, is on an entirely voluntary basis. And actually the figures do also state that almost 50% or slightly over 50% of people arrested actually either do not provide a community background or do not wish to disclose. And I think that we would all agree from the demographic of our Northern Ireland country that this is not reflective of the community either. So I think it is a very important issue. We recognise that this is a significant public interest, and actually the most preferable solution would be to have some enabling legislation so that we could collate the data, which would then become an accurate and reliable data source upon which to analyse and develop conclusions. And to this effect, in October 2021, we actually wrote to both the Justice Minister and the Northern Ireland Office, reiterating that as our position.
Okay, thank you, Mel. Question 3, recommendation 2 relates to a survey on human rights culture and awareness. 20 years on from the establishment of the PSNI, do you think human rights is embedded in policing culture? Again, John and then Mel. John.
I think the general answer is yes. The question is how is, and I've watched some of the training of new recruits to the police, and often the human rights issues are discussed, and I have very good relationships with a number of senior police officers who all speak the language of human rights, which is great. The reason for going ahead with this recommendation is to find out the fine detail. Are there gaps among some officers? What's the general approach? Have we moved on in a good way since 2004? So this is about collecting up the evidence.
Thank you. Mel.
Thank you, Chair. And I welcome that endorsement of the general answer is yes. And I refer back to the human rights lecture that I watched where a very experienced and respected human rights professional said it's a tried and tested template that merits consideration in other jurisdictions. And both of those comments are testament to the journey that policing has come on and embedded human rights into the police culture. But I'm not complacent about this matter either. The world is evolving, societies are evolving, and communities are evolving. And our understanding and application of those human rights principles have to keep apace and evolve with it. As I said in my opening remarks, police officers and staff are required to be human rights practitioners, and this requires skill, knowledge, understanding, and confidence, along with the humility that we must be reflective and continue to develop and learn.
Thank you. The next question 4 ties in with the question that we've received online while we've been talking. And the online question is, does the Policing Board reiterate its recommendation that the PSNI stop the use of spit and bite guards? And the question 4 that was submitted previously states, PSNI continues to use spit and bite guards despite the board recommendation to cease and have not yet implemented all of the Ombudsman's recommendations. What's the board's view on this? Well, the answer to the first question is yes, our position is still the same as it was previously, that we believe that spit and bite guards, which were introduced by the Chief Constable under his operational independence as part of the COVID arrangements, that we should desist from that and then review the policy completely. However, as the PSNI continue the implementation against the board advice, we will ensure that this is done with as much scrutiny across practical implementation, training and human rights issues as possible through our committees, and this monitoring is and will be ongoing. The Human Rights Advisor has received a report on spit and bite guards and will be conducting a thematic into their use, and John in fact referenced that earlier in his comments. He will report on the progress of this to the board in the new year. John, do you want to say anything more about it? No, you've stated enough. In that case, we'll go to Mel and ask if she wishes to comment on that.
Yeah, I really welcome the board's oversight on this matter, and it is important that we work through all of the evidence, all of the understanding, the human rights implication and the operational need, and take that through due process in reaching both the position that the Chief Constable and his team will reach in February, March next year, hopefully. Okay,
thank you for that. We're coming close to the end of our time, but I want to try and fit in another couple of questions here. Question 5, and this is to do with the use of stop and search. This would be a question for Mel. Many of the recommendations relate to the use of stop and search. Whilst it's recognised as an important tool for policing, disproportionate use can have a negative impact, as highlighted by the recommendations made in today's report. Why have PSNI failed to implement past recommendations by the board and did not progress a recommendation by the independent reviewer on the use of stop and search in respect of children and young people? Melanie.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's fair to acknowledge that the policing position on this particular recommendation has moved a long way since it was originally not accepted. Since the Ramsey case, there's been ongoing work. We've made several amendments to the information that is recorded during a search under the Justice and Security Act. Additionally, where children are concerned, we have made changes to the stop and search data collection to include a mandatory field to be completed where a person is aged under 18 years of age. In these cases, the officer must record why they decided that it was necessary and proportionate to conduct the search of the child in addition to the search of any adult present. So in conclusion, I do think that the police have moved a long way since the original recommendation was rejected, and we will continue to work to deliver against that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mel. And this will have to be the final question. John in particular, as I've said at the outset, is tight for time here. And it's with regard to retention around DNA. Why are PSNI continuing to retain biometric and DNA data despite a court ruling? John, you did touch on this in your overview, but again, just ask if you wish to say anything more about it before we go to Mel.
Yeah, just quickly, Doug. The problem is that not just PSNI, but police forces around England and Wales as well were collecting up data and retaining it for too long and in too many different categories of people. And the European Court of Human Rights ruled in many years ago that that was not acceptable and that the DNA should be deleted. And then there was a second case taken against the Psni in the European Court, which was also successful. Unfortunately, despite the attempts by Psni to resolve the situation, it needs legislation. It needs legislation that needs to be supported by the executive and by the assembly. And the latest position, unfortunately, is the executive and assembly, or the executive at least, has decided not to implement that legislation. That puts Psni in the frame, acting unlawfully, without the ability really to fix the problem. So this is a problem that, it will be Psni violating human rights, but their difficulty is they need legislation to deal with this properly, and the executive and the assembly are not delivering what they need.
Thank you, John. Melanie, you want to say anything more on that?
Yeah, just to thank John for recognising the difficult position that the Psni have been put in with the legislator deciding not to enact that legislation. But just to give a reassurance that we do continue to act in the spirit with the ratification committee continues to convene in order to consider cases on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this webinar today. Also to Temporary ACC Jones and to John Wadham for your contributions. Thanks to all who have submitted questions. If we aren't able to get to it or your question requires further clarity, we will get back to you. The board, as you may be aware, recently published a revised human rights monitoring framework, and we have a committee programme of work that ensures all elements of the framework are progressed. We're keen to engage and have feedback on how we do our work, and there is a small contract email address that you can send comments to. Thank you for joining us today. The full report is now available to view online. On behalf of the board, can I wish you all a happy and safe festive period. Thank you very much.